Okay guys, here is our flip lesson for the introduction to microbiology. It is a small but mighty topic. Okay, so this is a somewhat lengthy video. Um, the slides don't have a lot of information on it, but I wanted to get it all in one video. That way we can use class time to sort of break each section out and focus on the parts. Okay, all right, so first of all, we have to talk about what microbiology is. So biology is the study of living things, and the word micro means tiny. All right, so it's the study of microorganisms. So these would be tiny living things or tiny organisms that we can't see with the naked eye. They're mostly single-celled. Okay, and like I just said, we would have to use a microscope in order to see what we're talking about as far as microbiology. Okay, and it's important to know that when we talk about microorganisms, these tiny organisms, they can be good and bad, and we're going to talk about both of those. Okay, so let's talk about the good and the bad overall. Okay, so if these microorganisms cause disease or harm a living thing, we call those a pathogen. All right, and so you're going to see that word pathogen or pathogenic used quite a bit throughout this flip video. All right, some examples of pathogens could be a virus, protozoa, fungi, or even bacteria. Okay, so we're going to start with bacteria, and for each of these we're going to go over some just general characteristics. How do they reproduce, and then what is the good and the bad for each of them. So let's go over some general characteristics about bacteria. Okay, it is the oldest life form on our planet. These are the first things way back when our Earth started forming about 4.6 billion years ago. Bacteria were the first things to actually form on our planet. So these things are quite old. They are single-celled organisms, all right, and they have a very unique DNA. They're very specific, have a very, each one is different. So no two bacteria families are going to be the same. Their DNA is unique, kind of like humans. All right, and these bacteria, obviously, if they've been around since Earth's formation billions of years ago, they obviously can live in very extreme environments. So let's talk about reproduction and growth. We're going to explain that picture here in a minute. Okay, so they reproduce by a process called binary fission. All right, and what happens is one bacteria cell, so if we take a look here, this would be one bacteria cell, starts to morph itself into two pieces. And this one cell will split into two identical bacteria. All right, so we have sort of this parent cell that splits into two. All right, and it does this all on its own. And even though these two over here are separate, all right, they're separate bacteria, they are genetically the same. They have the same DNA. All right, so bacteria, because they have this ability to sort of reproduce on their own with really no help from anything, is part of the reason why they are the oldest life form on our planet. Okay, so to continue with this, they do grow in something called colonies, so there will be bunches of them together. All right, we can actually slow the growth, or growth can be slowed down if they get too cold, they get too hot, or actually by adding salt to whatever the bacteria is growing in. And we'll talk about why that's important here in a minute. Okay, so examples, if you want to preserve food or keep bacteria from growing, you put food in the refrigerator. That's going to preserve it. To get bacteria off your food, you're obviously going to boil or cook it. And then we talked about ways to preserve food in salt. That's going to keep bacteria from growing. So it's really important to know, especially like, let's say, colonial times, they used to preserve all their food in salt to keep bacteria from growing on it. All right, let's talk about the good when it comes to bacteria. All right, there are environmental goods. They do participate in the nitrogen cycle, which is a process on Earth that cycles nitrogen through the environment and atmosphere. And they are excellent at decomposing dead stuff, so adding things back into the soil to be used in the nitrogen cycle. They're good for people. All right, in food, cheeses and yogurts have good bacteria in order to keep that food healthy, I guess you could say. So there is good bacteria in your food. There are bacteria in medicines used to create antibiotics that you might get if you go to the doctor, you have a cold or something like that. And they can be used in genetic engineering. They can change genes in certain bacteria to make insecticides, which could be used for farming. All right, so now let's talk about the bad. Some bacteria are pathogenic. Remember, when we use that word pathogen, we mean it causes disease. Some examples of bacteria that are pathogens: tuberculosis, otherwise known as TB, MRSA, Lyme's disease, which you could get from a tick, and then strep throat. You can treat most of these with antibiotics. An example might be penicillin. But the overuse of antibiotics could mean that you get antibiotic resistance. So because these bacteria can sort of mutate and change in order to survive and reproduce through binary fission, they actually can become antibiotic resistant. And so you have to try different antibiotics depending on if the bacteria is responding or not. They can be prevented. We could prevent a few of these with vaccines. So when you were born and an infant, you probably got lots of vaccines. And what that does is it's usually a shot given to you so your body starts to produce these natural antibodies so they can defend bacteria on their own without you always getting sick every time you come in contact with bacteria. So here are some pictures. This is actually a picture of MRSA. So the green colonies you see there are the MRSA virus, which you have MRSA all over your skin. Your whole body's covered with MRSA. So sometimes like when you get a cut or things like that, and we talk about hand washing, that's the reason why this bacteria can get into your bloodstream and can make you actually really sick. All right, here is the strep throat virus or bacteria. So it's not necessarily a colony like this green, but it starts to form these long chains. So when you get a strep test, when they swab your throat, if these little strands start to grow, that is the strep virus. And this one right here is tuberculosis. So again, it's growing in sort of those long colonies of bacteria. Okay, so our next one we're going to talk about is viruses. So some common things with viruses: they're not living and they're not cellular. So that's important to know the difference between bacteria. Bacteria are living things, viruses are not. Viruses cannot reproduce on their own. They need help. All right. They do not use energy or need food. That's one of the characteristics of living things, that they obtain and use energy. And viruses aren't cellular and they're not living, so they don't have that quality. They do contain their own specific DNA, and it's sort of cased in something called a protein coat. So it's like a hard protective shell to keep that DNA safe. All right, and these are much smaller than bacteria. And if you were to take, and you need very high-powered microscopes to be able to see viruses. And when you do, they actually look a little robotic. We'll take a look at a few in class, but they look like little robots. So let's talk about how a virus will reproduce. It cannot reproduce on its own. They need a host cell. So a host cell is going to be some sort of cell within another organism that it's going to use sort of as its house to hang out in so it can reproduce. All right, typically the host cell will die as a result. All right, so when a virus reproduces, the cell in which it was being hosted will eventually die. Most use the host cell's machinery to reproduce. So every cell has organelles that you learned about, mitochondria, ribosomes, those sort of things. And so the virus will use those pieces to help itself reproduce. Very high tech classify, like just very much a system that is far beyond anything we can do as a human being. All right, so these viruses can actually remain inactive for long periods of time without us even knowing that they're there. And so it's not until they actually become, we become sick that we realize that we possibly have this virus. So the good thing with viruses, the environmental, they actually serve as a natural population control. If you think about a deer population, if deer didn't catch some sort of virus and we have an overrun of deer, that's going to disrupt the food chain. So viruses actually act as a good limiting factor, a natural way to keep the population stable. For people, viruses are actually a good source of new medications and new technology in the medical field. So we use these viruses to actually start looking for cures for many diseases. Now the bad. All right, they are pathogenic. All right, HIV is an example of a virus. Ebola, the flu is a virus. Rabies, chickenpox, and the common cold are all examples of viruses. So we cannot cure these, but symptoms can be treated. So if you've ever had the flu or a common cold, you know, you get maybe chills, achy, congestion. There are medicines you can take to control the symptoms, but you're not going to kill the virus. Antivirals can control or prevent the spread of some viruses. So there are things like HIV. There are drugs you can take for HIV that will prevent it from spreading to other people. Many can be prevented with vaccines. If you get a flu shot, right, that's a way to prevent. When you guys were born, if you got your vaccines as an infant, chicken pox is actually a vaccine you can get now. I'm too old the chickenpox vaccine was not invented when I was little, so I had chickenpox in the first grade. And it can spread if not. Now you guys are lucky in today's world you get vaccinated for the chickenpox. Here are some examples of what viruses look like, similar to what with the bacteria, so they can grow in these long chains, all right, like this right here. Much longer chain. I believe this one in the middle is the flu, all right, and then this one over here, this last one, I can't remember what that's a picture of, but it's more colony. You can see it grows in these little pods, all right, all over the place. So they look very similar under a microscope as a bacteria would. All right, our next one is fungi. All right, these are mostly multicellular, so made of many cells. So these are different from viruses and bacteria in that sense. All right, they do not produce their own food, so they are not photosynthetic. They are not a plant, and so that's really important to know that they don't photosynthesize, so they're not part of the plant family. All right, they can't move on their own. They need help to get from place to place, and we'll talk about how fungi reproduce. So fungi can reproduce one of two ways: sexually, which means they need two organisms for that to happen, or asexually, only one organism is needed. So for fungi to reproduce, they create something called spores, and they're dormant or they're not active for a long period of time. These are reproductive cells, and when the conditions are just right, these spores will aid in either sexual or asexual reproduction, depending on the type of fungi that we're talking about. All right, the good things with fungi, environmental, they do cycle nutrients. They're part of the decomposer part of a food web, decomposition, and they are an excellent food source if you like to eat mushrooms. All right, for people, fungi can be used to produce medicines and foods, and some of these fungi can actually convert insecticides, which can be bad things, into basic elements like carbon dioxide, water, or others. And so it's really important to know that fungi play a good role in the environment too. The bad when it comes to fungi, all right, some of them are pathogenic. They can be harmful, in fact, kill you if you eat the wrong kinds. All right, it will very much spoil food. Humans can be highly allergic. They can carry infection and disease, things like ringworm and athlete's foot. So I'm going to show you a picture of the microscopic view of ringworm and then what it actually looks like on the body. Okay, so over here on the left is the picture of ringworm. So you can see it sort of grows in these little colonies, all right? And they look like little worms, and what it shows up on your skin are these little round ring type things, all right? All created because of this. It very much can be cured. Same thing with athlete's foot. If you are an athlete, especially in the summertime, your feet get so hot that you start to grow this little fungus on your feet that, with certain medications can be cured. All right, protozoa. All right, these are single-celled and can usually move on their own. All right, so if you think about it, fungi are our only multicellular ones. Everything else is single-celled. Protozoa have a way to move. All right, they're found in very moist environments. All right, so where there's a lot of water present. All right, and very few are pathogenic. Some are, but very few of them. All right, a majority of protozoa reproduce by binary fission, just like bacteria, all right, where one parent cell sort of splits into two identical daughter cells. All right, the good and the bad. All right, protozoa are basically the building blocks of every food chain. All right, they start every food chain leading, and without them, the food chain wouldn't exist, and we as humans wouldn't be here either. They aid in nutrient cycling in the environment, so things like the nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, things like that, they help with those processes. All right, bad, if they are pathogenic, they could actually kill you. So diseases like malaria and Giardia are examples of protozoa-bound disease or infection that we see in the real world. Here's a picture. You can see what you see on here in purple is going to be the protozoa that is growing on these perfectly healthy cells. And that's our lesson.